Jake Sullivan stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately felt small. The docking bay of Nexus Station stretched out like a metal canyon around him, filled with creatures that made him look like a child among giants. His uniform felt tight against his shoulders as he adjusted his diplomatic bag and tried to stand straighter. At 5 feet 8 inches, he had always been average height among humans, but here he might as well have been a mouse walking into a gathering of lions, the Corthany. Delegates stood 12 feet tall with thick shell-like armor covering their bodies. Their forearms moved with mechanical precision as they unloaded cargo containers that weighed more than Jake's entire shuttle. Each step they took made the metal floor ring like a bell. Their faces looked like insect heads with massive compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. When one of them glanced down at Jake, it was like being studied by a machine built for war. Even taller were the Vexstar with their long snake-like necks that let them tower 15 feet high. Their scales shimmered green and black under the station lights, and their claws clicked against the metal deck plates as they walked. Jake had read about them in the briefing files, but seeing them in person made his stomach turn. These were predators from a world where nothing grew larger than a house cat except for the things that ate house cats. Admiral Kate Morrison appeared at his side, looking just as uncomfortable as he felt. She had been Earth's top diplomat for 20 years, but even she seemed shaken by the size and power of the alien delegates around them. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her blue uniform was pressed to military perfection, but Jake could see the worry lines around her eyes. "Remember, Jake," she said quietly, "we're not here to impress them with our size. We're here to show them what humans can contribute to the defense effort. The Devourers are coming whether these species like us or not, and Earth has something valuable to offer." Jake nodded, but wondered what exactly that might be. The briefing files had been clear about the threat. The Devourers were machines that consumed entire star systems, turning planets into raw materials for their ever-growing fleets. They had already destroyed 6 civilizations and were moving toward the core worlds where billions lived. Every species in the galaxy was being asked to contribute to a massive defense force, but Earth's military seemed laughably small compared to what the other worlds could field. They walked through corridors filled with delegates from dozens of species. Some moved on legs like tree trunks, while others floated through the air on energy fields that made Jake's skin tingle. A few looked almost human until they turned their heads and revealed faces with too many eyes or mouths full of teeth, designed for tearing metal. Jake tried not to stare, but it was impossible to look away from beings that seemed to have stepped out of nightmares. The assembly hall was even more intimidating than the docking bay. It rose up like the inside of a cathedral with balconies and platforms arranged in a complex pattern that let delegates of different sizes and atmospheric needs participate together. Jake found his assigned seat at the very bottom level in a chair that seemed designed for children. Around him, the other delegates settled into massive thrones and floating platforms that put them dozens of feet above his head. War Chief Thexmore of the Corthany took his place on a platform that made him look like a statue of some ancient god of war. His armor was decorated with symbols that Jake's translator couldn't interpret, but which probably represented battles and victories stretching back centuries. When Thexmore spoke, his voice boomed through the hall like thunder rolling across mountains. "We gather to face the greatest threat our galaxy has ever known," he announced. "The Devourers show no mercy and take no prisoners. They consume everything in their path and grow stronger with each world they destroy. Only through united action can we hope to stop them." Commander Xylith of the Vexstar rose on her platform with fluid grace that reminded Jake of a snake preparing to strike. Her voice was softer than Thexmore's, but somehow more dangerous. "Each species must contribute according to their capabilities," she said. "This is not a time for the weak to hide behind the strong. Those who cannot fight must find other ways to serve." Her eyes found Jake in his small chair, and he felt like a rabbit that had just been spotted by a hawk. The message was clear enough. Earth was expected to contribute, but not as an equal partner in the fighting. One by one, the delegates presented their military capabilities. The Corthony could field 10 million warriors equipped with weapons that could crack planetary crust. The Vexstar had fleets of ships that moved faster than light and struck without warning. The Crystalline Collective offered energy weapons that could turn asteroids to vapor. Each presentation was more impressive than the last, and Jake felt himself shrinking further into his chair. When his turn came, the hall fell silent in a way that felt more like curiosity than respect. Jake stood up, knowing that even standing he was still looking up at delegates who remained seated. He activated his presentation device and tried to project confidence he didn't feel. "Earth offers 50,000 soldiers," he began. His voice sounded thin in the vast hall. "We have a small fleet of ships and some weapons that, while not as powerful as yours, have proven effective in our own conflicts. We also bring experience in unconventional warfare and tactics that might prove useful against an enemy like the Devourers." The silence that followed felt like being trapped under ice. Then Commander Xylith began to laugh. It was not a pleasant sound. Other delegates joined in until the hall echoed with amusement that made Jake's cheeks burn with embarrassment. 50,000, Dexmore rumbled. The Corthony lose more than that in training exercises. What possible use could such a tiny force be against enemies that destroy entire star systems? "Perhaps they could carry supplies," suggested another delegate. "Or tend to wounded warriors after real soldiers have done the fighting." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. "Humans have survived and thrived on a world that tried to kill us in every possible way," he said. "We've learned to fight smarter when we can't fight stronger. We've learned to adapt and improvise and find advantages where others see only problems." "Pretty words," Xylith hissed. "But words don't stop Devourer assault ships. Size and strength and numbers win wars, not clever speeches from tiny creatures." The laughter returned louder than before. Jake sat down, feeling his face burn with shame and frustration. Around him, the great powers of the galaxy continued their discussions as if Earth no longer existed. He had come here hoping to prove that humanity deserved a place at this table, but instead, he had only confirmed their worst assumptions about his species. But from somewhere, in the shadows of the upper galleries, Jake felt eyes watching him with an intensity that was different from the casual dismissal of the other delegates. Someone up there was taking him seriously, even if no one else was. He couldn't see who it was, but somehow he knew that this wasn't over yet. 3 days had passed since Jake's humiliating presentation, and the mood on Nexus Station had grown darker with each passing hour. Reports kept coming in from the outer systems, and none of them were good. The Devourers were moving faster than anyone had predicted, consuming worlds and fleets with mechanical efficiency that left no survivors to tell what they had learned. Jake spent most of his time in the human quarters reviewing tactical data and trying to find some way to make his species useful in the coming war. Admiral Morrison had been called to emergency sessions with the other senior commanders, but she always returned looking more frustrated than before. The great powers were making plans that treated Earth like a minor supply depot rather than a military partner. On the morning of the 4th day, alarms began wailing throughout the station. Jake rushed to the command center, where massive displays showed the star charts of nearby systems. Red markers were spreading across the map like drops of blood in water. The Devourers had broken through the outer defense lines and were only 2 systems away from Nexus Station itself. War Chief Dexmore stood before the assembled delegates like a mountain of rage and determination. "The enemy approaches faster than our intelligence predicted," he announced. "We must launch immediate reconnaissance missions to determine their strength and intentions." "Who will volunteer their forces for this dangerous task?" Several species offered their scout ships and stealth vessels, but Jake saw an opportunity that might never come again. He stood up from his small chair and raised his voice above the discussions taking place around him. "Earth Special Forces are trained for exactly this kind of mission," he called out. "We excel at gathering intelligence behind enemy lines without being detected. Let us prove our worth by doing what we do best." The hall fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Instead of amusement, there was something closer to disbelief. Commander Xylith turned her predatory gaze on Jake, and he could see calculation behind her reptilian eyes. The human offers his warriors for a suicide mission, she said slowly. How noble of such a small species to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. But reconnaissance requires stealth and skill, not just willingness to die. Vexmore's compound eyes focused on Jake with mechanical precision. Your enthusiasm is noted, human, but this mission requires capabilities that your people simply do not possess. The Devourers have sensors that can detect a butterfly's heartbeat from orbit. They have defenses that would destroy your largest ships before they could even approach their territory. Jake felt the familiar anger rising in his chest, but this time he channeled it into something more useful. Then let me propose a test, he sighed. If human soldiers can successfully infiltrate and gather intelligence from a heavily defended position without being detected, will you consider our contribution valuable? The alien delegates looked at each other with what might have been surprise. Jake continued before they could dismiss him again. The Corthany military compound here on the station is supposed to be impregnable. Your best security systems and your finest guards protect it. If my team can penetrate that compound, gather detailed intelligence, and withdraw without being caught, then you'll know we have something to offer this alliance. War Chief Vexmore's armor plates shifted in what Jake had learned was the Corthany equivalent of laughter. You propose to infiltrate our military headquarters, the same headquarters that has never been breached by any hostile force in over 200 years of service. That's exactly what I'm proposing, Jake replied. But if we fail, then Earth accepts whatever support role you assign us without complaint. We'll serve as supply carriers or medical technicians or whatever else you think we're capable of. The discussion that followed was intense and conducted in several languages that Jake's translator couldn't handle, but eventually Vexmore raised one of his forearms for silence. Very well, human. You have until dawn tomorrow to attempt this infiltration. We will monitor every corridor, every sensor, every guard post. When your team is captured, we will treat them well and return them to you unharmed. But Earth's roll in. This alliance will be decided by your failure. Jake nodded and left the assembly hall, feeling the weight of his entire species resting on his shoulders. Admiral Morrison caught up with him in the corridor, looking both proud and terrified. Jake, what have you done? She whispered. The Corthany compound is legendary for its security. Even our best intelligence estimates suggest it would take a full battalion to breach those defenses. Maybe a full battalion attacking from the front, Jake replied. But we're not going to attack. We're going to infiltrate, and that's something humans have always been good at. That night, Jake gathered his team in the maintenance section of the human quarters. He had brought 6 of Earth's finest special operations soldiers with him to the summit, and now their skills would determine humanity's role in the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen. Sergeant Lisa Parker was a demolitions expert who could make a bomb out of spare parts and cleaning supplies. Corporal Danny Rodriguez had spent years in urban warfare and knew how to move through hostile territory like smoke. Lieutenant Amy Foster was a communications specialist who could hack any system given enough time and the right tools. The others were equally skilled in their own fields, and Jake had never been more grateful for human military training. They spent hours studying the blueprints of the Corthany compound that Jake had managed to obtain through diplomatic channels. The building was a fortress within a fortress with motion sensors, heat detectors, pressure plates, and armed guards at every critical junction. But Jake could see weaknesses that the Corthany had never considered because they thought like Corthany. The compound had been designed to stop large armored attackers moving in organized formations. It was built to counter the kind of direct assault that most military species would attempt. But humans had learned warfare on a world where the biggest predators weren't always the most dangerous ones. Sometimes the greatest threats came from small creatures that moved quietly and struck without warning. At midnight, Jake led his team into the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the station. The air was thick and hot and filled with the smell of recycling systems and power conduits. They moved single file through passages barely wide enough for human shoulders, carrying equipment that would have been useless to larger species. Above them, the delegates were watching through security monitors, expecting to see humans stumble around like lost children until the Corthany guards captured them. Instead, they saw empty corridors and silent passages. where 6 shadows moved without triggering a single alarm. Sergeant Parker disabled the first sensor array with a device that generated false readings while the team slipped past. Corporal Rodriguez found a ventilation shaft that led directly into the compound's lower levels, bypassing 3 checkpoints that would have stopped any conventional assault. Lieutenant Foster tapped into the guard communication system and began feeding false reports that kept the sentries looking in the wrong directions. One by one, the compound's defenses fell to techniques that the Corthony had never encountered. Humans were small enough to fit through spaces that larger species couldn't even see. They were quiet enough to move past guards who were listening for the heavy footsteps of armored warriors. They were clever enough to turn the compound's own systems against it. When Jake's team reached the central command center, they found it exactly as defended as the Corthony had promised. But they also found something else. Standing in the shadows watching the infiltration with obvious interest was a figure that Jake had only heard about in whispered conversations among the other delegates. Kalen Nightstalker was 7 feet of predatory grace wrapped in dark armor that seemed to absorb light. His species, the Shadowhunt, were legendary throughout the galaxy as the greatest hunters and trackers ever born. They were solitary creatures who rarely worked with others and never involved themselves in galactic politics. His presence at the summit had surprised everyone, but no one had been brave enough to ask why he was there. Now he stood watching Jake's team with yellow eyes that missed nothing. When Jake made eye contact with him, Kalen gave a slight nod that might have been approval or might have been acknowledgement that he had found something worth his attention. The mission was completed flawlessly. Jake's team extracted detailed intelligence on Corthony defensive strategies, patrol schedules, and weapon capabilities, then withdrew through the same routes they had used to enter. By dawn, they were back in the human quarters with data that would have taken conventional forces weeks to gather. The assembly hall was silent when Jake presented his findings to the stunned delegates. War Chief Vexmore examined the intelligence reports with growing amazement while Commander Xylith studied the security recordings that showed humans moving through spaces she hadn't even known existed. But the greatest surprise came when Kalen Nightstalker stepped forward from the shadows where he had been watching. For the first time since arriving at the summit, he spoke directly to another delegate. "The human has shown capabilities that deserve respect," he said in a voice like distant thunder. "His people understand that strength comes in many forms and that the smallest hunter can bring down the largest prey." The victory celebration was short-lived. Jake had barely finished presenting his intelligence findings when the station's emergency systems activated with a sound like the end of the world. Red lights bathed the assembly hall in bloody illumination, while automated voices announced in a dozen languages that immediate evacuation procedures were now in effect. Admiral Morrison appeared on the main display looking haggard and frightened. Her image flickered as the communication system struggled with interference from whatever was approaching the system. "Devourer scouts have been detected at the system's edge," she announced. "Long-range sensors show at least 12 vessels moving at maximum speed toward our position. Estimated time of arrival is 6 hours. All non-essential personnel are ordered to begin immediate evacuation." The hall erupted into chaos as delegates from dozens of species tried to process this information. 6 hours was not enough time to evacuate a station the size of Nexus. The massive transport ships that had brought the larger delegates here would need at least 10 hours to load their passengers and clear the system safely. War Chief Vexmore rose from his platform with armor plates grinding like tectonic shifts. "My warriors will remain to defend the station," he declared. "The Corthony do not retreat from any enemy no matter the odds." Commander Xylith coiled her serpentine neck in patterns that Jake had learned meant disagreement. "Bravery without purpose is merely suicide," she hissed. "The station cannot be defended against Devourer attack ships. We must preserve our forces for battles we can win." Other delegates joined the argument, but Jake could see the mathematics of the situation clearly. The transport ships could evacuate perhaps 60% of the people on the station before the Devourers arrived. The rest would be trapped here when the enemy came calling. He looked around the hall at beings who had dismissed him and his species just days ago. They were terrified now, and he couldn't blame them. The Devourers had destroyed civilizations that were older and more powerful than most of these delegates could imagine. But terror was making them think only about saving themselves instead of finding solutions that could save everyone. Jake stood up from his small chair, and his voice carried clearly through the arguing voices around him. My team and I volunteer to stay behind and delay the Devourer scouts. The hall fell silent so quickly that Jake could hear the hum of the air recycling systems. Every eye in the chamber focused on him with expressions ranging from disbelief to something that might have been respect. War Chief Thexmore spoke first. Human, your courage is noted, but 50 of your soldiers could not delay Devourer forces that would challenge entire fleets. This is not bravery, but madness. We don't need to defeat them, Jake replied. We just need to buy enough time for the evacuation to complete. Hit-and-run tactics, harassment, sabotage anything that slows them down or diverts their attention from the fleeing transports. Commander Xylith unwound her coils and leaned forward with predatory interest. And what makes you think your tiny force could accomplish what our combined fleets could not? Jake had been thinking about this question since the first alarm sounded. The answer came from everything he had learned about human warfare and the nature of asymmetric conflict. Because we're not trying to win a conventional battle, he explained. We're trying to be annoying enough that they focus on hunting us down instead of chasing the evacuation ships. Humans have always been good at being annoying to larger, more powerful enemies. The discussion that followed was heated and conducted in multiple languages, but Jake could sense that something had changed. The delegates were no longer dismissing his offer out of hand. They were actually considering whether a small human force might be able to accomplish what seemed impossible. Then Kalen Nightstalker stepped forward from the shadows where he had been observing the debate. The legendary hunter moved with fluid grace that made Jake think of smoke given form. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had survived things that would destroy lesser beings. I will stand with Jake Sullivan, he announced. For too long the Shadow Hunt have remained apart from galactic conflicts, but this enemy threatens all life in the galaxy. If the human is willing to sacrifice himself for others, then he has earned the right to fight beside a warrior. The silence that followed felt different from anything Jake had experienced since arriving at Nexus Station. This was not the silence of dismissal or mockery, but something closer to awe. The legendary Kalen Nightstalker had never been known to work with other species. His presence at the summit had been surprising enough, but his offer to fight alongside humans was unprecedented. War Chief Thexmore's compound eyes focused on Jake with new intensity. If the greatest hunter in the galaxy believes your mission has merit, then perhaps we have underestimated human capabilities once again. The evacuation began immediately with transport ships arriving at the docking bays in waves. Jake watched from the command center as beings who had towered over him just hours ago struggled to fit themselves into vessels designed for emergency departures. The Corthany had to disassemble some of their armor to squeeze through transport hatches, while the Vexstar coiled themselves into cargo pods like enormous snakes. Admiral Morrison found Jake as he was preparing his equipment for the coming battle. Her face showed the strain of trying to coordinate an evacuation that everyone knew was probably doomed to fail. Jake, what you're doing is either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish, she said. I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. There isn't, Jake replied. But someone has to buy time for all those people to get away. If it's going to be anyone, it might as well be humans. We've always been good at impossible missions. She hugged him then with the desperation of someone who knew she might never see him again. Jake felt the weight of Earth's hopes and fears in that embrace, but also something else. For the first time since arriving at Nexus Station, he felt like he was representing his species as an equal rather than a supplicant. Kalen approached them with equipment that looked like it had been designed by nightmares. His weapons were things of beauty and terror, crafted with precision that spoke of centuries of hunting experience. But when he looked at Jake, there was something like respect in those predatory yellow eyes. Your people understand something that most species have forgotten, Kalen said. True strength comes not from size or numbers, but from the willingness to adapt and sacrifice for others. The Shadow Hunt learned this truth long ago, but we forgot how to share it with others. They spent the next 4 hours turning Nexus Station into a maze of traps and ambush points. Jake's Marines worked alongside Kellen's hunting instincts to create kill zones that would channel enemy forces into prepared positions. They rigged explosive charges in corridor junctions, planted improvised mines in areas where large forces would naturally advance, and created choke points that would force the Devourers to fight on human terms rather than their own. Sergeant Parker found ways to turn the station's own systems into weapons. Emergency fire suppression systems became poison gas dispensers, while artificial gravity generators became crushing traps for enemies who weren't expecting the floor to suddenly weigh 10 times normal. Lieutenant Foster hacked into the communication networks and began preparing electronic warfare attacks that would disrupt Devourer coordination. But the real breakthrough came when Jake and Kaylin began working together directly. The human understanding of improvised warfare, combined with centuries of shadow hunting experience, created tactics that neither species could have developed alone. They learned to coordinate attacks across multiple levels of the station, using environmental advantages that larger species would never have considered. Kaylin taught Jake how to read enemy movement patterns and predict where forces would concentrate for maximum effect. Jake showed Kaylin how to turn everyday objects into lethal weapons and how to use an enemy's expectations against them. By the time the last transport ship departed, they had created something that was neither human nor shadow hunt tactics, but a fusion of both that was more dangerous than either alone. The final evacuation ship carried Admiral Morrison and the last of the diplomatic staff. Jake watched it disappear into hyperspace, knowing that he had probably seen Earth's representatives for the last time. The station felt empty now, with only 50 humans and one shadow hunt remaining to face whatever was coming. But as Jake checked his weapons and reviewed their defensive positions, he realized that he wasn't afraid. For the first time since arriving at Nexus Station, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what humans were meant to do. They were going to make the Devourers pay for every inch of corridor and every moment of delay. Beside him, Kaylin finished his own preparations with ritualistic precision that spoke of countless battles survived through skill and cunning. When their eyes met, Jake saw something that looked like kinship between two warriors who understood that some things were worth dying for. The station's sensors detected the approaching Devourer ships just as the last evacuation vessel cleared the system's edge. Jake activated the communication system and broadcast on all frequencies so that anyone still listening would know what was about to happen. The first Devourer scouts docked with Nexus Station like mechanical parasites latching onto a dying host. Jake watched through security monitors as 12-foot-tall constructs of black metal and pulsing energy cut through the station's outer hull with tools that turned solid metal into vapor. Each unit moved with the precision of a machine, but also with something that looked disturbingly like intelligence. Sergeant Parker had rigged the main docking bay with enough explosives to crack a moon, but the Devourers ignored the obvious entry points entirely. Instead, they cut their own holes in sections of the station that should have been impossible to breach. Their adaptive learning protocols had already analyzed the station's structure and identified weaknesses that Jake's team hadn't even considered. "They're not following any predictable pattern," Lieutenant Foster reported from her position at the communications console. "My electronic warfare attacks are having minimal effect, and they're adapting to our countermeasures faster than I can deploy them." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's failing life support systems. They had planned their defense around the assumption that the Devourers would behave like conventional military forces, but these enemies were something entirely different. They learned from every encounter and shared that knowledge instantly with all other units. Kaylin appeared beside him, moving through the shadows with that predatory grace that made Jake's human eyes struggle to track his movements. The Shadow Hunt's yellow eyes were focused on the security displays with an intensity that spoke of centuries spent studying prey behavior. "They hunt like a pack," Kaylin observed, "but a pack with a shared mind that learns from every mistake. Traditional ambush tactics will only work once before they adapt and counter our strategies. Then we don't use traditional tactics," Jake replied. We improvise faster than they can learn. We hit them with something different every time and never give them a chance to develop counters. The first wave of devourers entered the station through the holes they had cut in the outer hull. Jake's team waited in prepared positions while the enemy units moved through corridors that should have been empty. But the humans had learned stealth from growing up on a world where making noise meant becoming something else's dinner. Corporal Rodriguez struck first from a ventilation shaft that the devourers hadn't even detected. His improvised explosive device tore through the lead unit's leg joints, sending it crashing into the wall where Sergeant Parker's secondary charges finished the job. The other devourers immediately adapted their formation to cover the ventilation system, but by then Rodriguez was already gone. Jake coordinated the attack from a mobile command post that changed location every few minutes. Human tactics had always relied on mobility and unpredictability because they couldn't afford to fight fair against stronger enemies. Now those same principles were being applied against foes that made the most dangerous. Earth predators look like house cats. The real genius emerged when Kalen began working directly alongside Jake's Marines. The Shadowhunt's hunting instincts allowed him to predict where the Devourers would go before their own tactical programs could calculate optimal routes. He would appear in corridors just as enemy units arrived, herding them into human kill zones with precise strikes that forced them to retreat in specific directions. Lieutenant Foster discovered that while the Devourers adapted quickly to electronic attacks, they had trouble with purely analog systems. She began using the station's mechanical infrastructure against them, turning ventilation fans into projectile weapons and pressure systems into crushing traps. The enemy units could learn to counter computer viruses, but they struggled with attacks that used basic physics and mechanical advantage. The first major success came when Jake led a squad of Marines through maintenance tunnels to attack a group of Devourers from below. Using nothing but shaped charges made from cleaning supplies and metal fragments from damaged systems they created a trap that collapsed an entire corridor section on top of 6 enemy units. The Devourers' adaptive armor protected them from the initial explosion, but couldn't handle several tons of structural debris falling on their heads. But victory came with a price. Each destroyed Devourer transmitted detailed tactical data back to their collective intelligence before shutting down. The second wave that entered the station an hour later had already adapted to every trick Jake's team had used. They moved in smaller groups that were harder to trap, used different entry points that bypassed the remaining explosive charges, and deployed countermeasures against the specific weapons that had proven effective. Jake found himself constantly evolving his tactics, staying one step ahead of an enemy that learned from every encounter. When the Devourers adapted to his explosive traps, he switched to kinetic weapons that used the station's artificial gravity to accelerate metal fragments to lethal velocities. When they countered those attacks, he began using the environmental systems to create atmospheric hazards that their sensors couldn't detect until it was too late. The turning point came when Kalen demonstrated why the Shadowhunt were considered the greatest hunters in the galaxy. He began stalking individual Devourer units through the station's darker sections using terrain and psychology in ways that even their adaptive intelligence couldn't counter. A Devourer might adapt to specific weapons or tactics, but it was much harder to adapt to an enemy who understood predator-prey relationships at an instinctual level. Jake watched through security monitors as Kalen led a pair of Devourers through a section of the station where the artificial gravity had been reversed. The enemy units expected the floor to provide stable footing, but instead found themselves falling toward the ceiling where Jake's Marines were waiting with improvised spears made from structural supports. It was a trap that required perfect timing and understanding of how prey would react to unusual environmental conditions. "Your people and mine think differently about warfare," Kalen said during a brief lull in the fighting. "Humans adapt through intelligence and creativity, while Shadowhunt adapt through instinct and experience. Together we become something that neither species could achieve alone." Jake nodded as he watched Sergeant Parker turn a food processing unit into a projectile weapon using spare parts and chemical reactions that shouldn't have been possible. "We've always been good at making do with what we have," Sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones nobody expects. The battle continued for hours, with Jake's force constantly retreating through prepared positions, while inflicting maximum damage on their pursuers. They turned the station's own systems against the invaders, using everything from artificial gravity to atmospheric processing equipment as weapons. But slowly the Devourers were learning and adapting to each new tactic faster than humans could develop them. The crisis came when the main Devourer force arrived with hundreds of additional units pouring into the station through multiple breach points. Jake's team had managed to destroy over 30 enemy units, but they were running out of space to retreat and tricks to deploy. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clear, and they weren't favorable to the defenders. Lieutenant Foster's voice crackled over the communication system with news that Jake had been dreading. "Commander, the evacuation fleet has cleared the outer system boundary. All civilian and diplomatic personnel are safe, but we're detecting massive energy signatures approaching our position. The main Devourer fleet will be here within the hour." Jake felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They had accomplished their mission of buying time for the evacuation, but continuing the fight now meant certain death for his entire team. The logical choice was to retreat to Kellen's ship and escape while they still could, but Jake also knew that the station's central computer core contained detailed information about every major population center in the galaxy. If the Devourers captured that data intact, they would have target lists that could guide their expansion for years to come. Someone needed to destroy those records, even if it meant staying behind to ensure the job was done properly. He gathered his team in what had once been the diplomatic quarters where this entire adventure had begun. The humans looked exhausted but determined, while Kalen stood in the shadows like a statue carved from midnight. When Jake explained the situation and what needed to be done, there was no discussion or debate. They all understood what was at stake. Sergeant Parker began preparing the charges that would destroy the computer core, while Lieutenant Foster worked to purge as much diplomatic data as possible before the final confrontation. Corporal Rodriguez and the other Marines checked their weapons and prepared defensive positions around the central command center. Kalen approached Jake as the final preparations were being made. The legendary hunter looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been farewell. "Your species understands honor in ways that many others have forgotten," Kalen said. "It has been a privilege to hunt beside you, Jake Sullivan of Earth." Jake felt emotions that he couldn't quite name rising in his chest. "The privilege has been mine, Kalen Nightstalker. Whatever happens next, we've shown the galaxy that humans and Shadowhunt can stand together as equals." The final battle for Nexus Station began at dawn station time when waves of Devourer units converged on the central command center from every possible direction. Jake crouched behind an overturned console watching security monitors that showed mechanical nightmares cutting through blast doors like they were made of paper. His remaining ammunition was down to 3 magazines, and he could hear Sergeant Parker's demolition charges detonating in the outer corridors as she tried to slow the enemy advance. Beside him, Kalen moved like liquid shadow, striking at Devourers that ventured too close to their defensive perimeter. The Shadowhunt's weapons seemed to find weak points in enemy armor that shouldn't have existed, while his movements stayed just ahead of targeting systems that adapted to predict where he would be next. But even the greatest hunter in the galaxy couldn't be everywhere at once, and there were simply too many enemies converging on their position. Lieutenant Foster worked frantically at the main computer terminal, purging diplomatic records and military intelligence that could guide Devourer expansion for decades to come. Her fingers flew over controls that sparked and smoked from battle damage, while she raced against time and approaching footsteps that echoed through the station's corridors like mechanical thunder. "Data purge is at 70%, she called out over the sound of weapons fire. "I need another 10 minutes to wipe the core memory banks completely." Jake looked at the tactical display and felt his heart sink. They didn't have 10 minutes. The Devourers had broken through the outer defensive lines and were already cutting through the blast doors that protected the command center. In less than 5 minutes, this room would be overrun by enemies that had adapted to counter every trick His team had developed. Corporal Rodriguez appeared from a side corridor, dragging a wounded Marine behind him. His uniform was torn and bloody, but his eyes still held the determined fire that had made him one of Earth's finest soldiers. "They've breached sections 7 through 12, he reported. Parker's charges slowed them down, but they're cutting new routes through the bulkheads. We've got maybe 3 minutes before they reach this position." Jake felt the weight of command, and the knowledge that he was about to lead his people into a battle they couldn't win. But he also felt something else, pride in how far they had come and what they had accomplished against impossible odds. When this mission started, the galaxy had dismissed humans as too small and weak to matter. Now they were making their last stand beside the most legendary warrior any of them had ever heard of. The first Devourers appeared at the command center. Entrance moving with mechanical precision that spoke of shared intelligence and perfect coordination. Jake opened fire with his assault rifle, watching armor-piercing rounds spark off adaptive plating that shifted to deflect incoming projectiles. But human weapons had never been about raw power. They were about putting the right amount of force in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Sergeant Parker's final surprise activated as the enemy units advanced into the command center. The entire floor had been rigged with shaped charges that turned metal deck plates into projectiles, aimed upward at joint mechanisms that even adaptive armor couldn't completely protect. 3 Devourers fell in the first seconds as their leg assemblies were shattered by debris moving at supersonic velocity, but more enemies poured through the breach faster than Jake's dwindling team could stop them. His Marines fought with desperate courage, using every trick they had learned in years of asymmetric warfare, but they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and adaptive intelligence that countered their tactics almost as quickly as they could deploy them. Kalen appeared beside Jake, moving with predatory grace that made the human's eyes struggle to follow his movements. The Shadowhunt's weapons cut through Devourer armor like it was designed specifically to counter their defenses. But even his legendary skills couldn't overcome the mathematics of 40-to-1 odds. "The data purge is complete," Lieutenant Foster announced as enemy fire began to concentrate on her position. "Old diplomatic records and military intelligence have been wiped from the core systems." Jake felt a moment of satisfaction knowing that whatever happened next, they had denied the Devourers the information they needed to target civilian populations efficiently. But that victory would be meaningless if they couldn't escape to tell the galaxy what they had learned about fighting these enemies. "Kalen," Jake called out during a brief lull in the fighting, "your ship is fast enough to outrun anything they have. Take Foster and get this tactical data back to the fleet. They need to know how to fight these things." The Shadowhunt turned those predatory yellow eyes on Jake with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been insult. "I do not abandon battle, brothers, when the hunt reaches its climax," he replied. "If you choose to make your final stand here, then I will stand beside you until the end." Jake felt emotions rising in his chest that he didn't have words for. This legendary warrior, who had never worked with other species, was willing to die beside humans who had been dismissed as weaklings just days ago. But he also realized that Kellen's sacrifice would be meaningless if the tactical intelligence they had gathered died with them. "And then we all go together," Jake decided. "Foster, can you rig the fusion reactor to overload?" Lieutenant Foster's eyes widened as she understood what Jake was suggesting. "I can set it to go critical in 60 seconds. The explosion will take out everything within 100,000 kilometers, including any Devourer ships in the immediate area." "Do it," Jake ordered. "If we can't escape, then we'll make sure these bastards remember what it costs to corner desperate humans." The reactor overload sequence began with warning alarms that added the voices to the chaos of battle. Jake's remaining Marines formed a final defensive line around the command center while Devourers poured through breaches in the walls like mechanical ants. The countdown display showed 50 seconds and falling while enemy fire grew more concentrated and accurate. Kalen fought beside Jake with fluid grace that turned combat into a deadly dance. The Shadowhunt's weapons found gaps in adaptive armor while his movements stayed just ahead of targeting computers that tried to predict his next position. But Jake could see that even the greatest hunter in the galaxy was beginning to slow under the weight of impossible odds. 30 seconds remained when Jake spotted something that changed everything. A maintenance hatch in the floor that led to service tunnels running beneath the command center. The same kind of tunnels that had allowed his team to infiltrate the Corthony compound and prove their worth to the galaxy. It was a desperate chance, but it might be their only hope of survival. "Kalen," Jake shouted over the sound of weapons fire. "Can your ship dock with the lower maintenance bay?" The Shadowhunt's eyes followed Jake's gaze to the floor hatch, and understanding flashed across his predatory features. "If we can reach it before the reactor goes critical, but the timing will have to be perfect." 20 seconds showed on the countdown display when Jake made his decision. "Everyone into the tunnels now. Foster, can you delay the overload by 30 seconds? I can give you 45 if I stay here to manually control the sequence," she replied. "But someone has to remain at the console, or the Devourers might be able to abort the detonation." Jake felt his heart break as he realized what she was offering. Lieutenant Amy Foster had served with distinction on 3 different worlds and had never failed to complete a mission. Now she was volunteering to stay behind to ensure that their sacrifice would accomplish something meaningful. "I'll stay with her," Sergeant Parker announced. "Someone needs to watch her back while she works." There was no time to argue or debate. Jake grabbed the tactical data cores while Kalen provided covering fire that kept the advancing Devourers from overrunning their position. The surviving Marines dropped through the floor hatch into maintenance tunnels that led toward the lower docking bays where Kellen's ship waited. Behind them, Foster and Parker made their last stand at the reactor controls. Jake could hear their weapons fire echoing through the station's corridors as they bought precious seconds with their lives. He ran through cramped tunnels with tears streaming down his face, knowing that he would never see either of them again. Kellen's ship was a sleek Predator designed for speed and stealth rather than comfort. Jake's remaining Marines squeezed into a cargo hold that was barely large enough for humans while Kalen piloted them away from the station at maximum acceleration. Through the rear sensors, Jake watched Nexus Station grow smaller behind them, until it was just another point of light against the stars. The explosion, when it came, lit up the entire system like a newborn sun. The fusion reactor's detonation tore through space with energy that made planets seem small by comparison. Jake watched through tears as the place where Foster and Parker had made their final sacrifice became an expanding sphere of superheated plasma that consumed everything within its reach, but they had done it. The tactical data that could save millions of lives was safe, and the Devourer scouting force had been destroyed before it could report back to the main fleet. 2 humans had given their lives to buy time for the entire galaxy, and their sacrifice would not be forgotten.